Celeste, are you ready to go? Can you hear me, Celeste?
Testing.
Celeste, can you hear me?
Okay, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. All right.
Are we good?
Yeah, I think we're good to go. All right. Let me go ahead and I'll start, and then I'll introduce you and let you take over.
Okay.
Thanks everybody for coming today and for attending the 2020 Sunstone Digital Symposium. This is session 266. It's titled Married to My Faith Crisis. And the audio from this session will be available for purchase at sunstone.org after the symposium. The video recording of this session will be available in the Whova app for approximately 3 months, beginning at the end of August 2020. If you'd like to ask questions today, please type your questions into the Whova app. They'll be addressed at our Q&A after the presentation. At Sunstone, we're making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, there is more than one way to Mormon. And we invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. About this presentation, in the words of our presenter, quote, "In 2014, I did something stupid and wonderful. Despite being woefully underqualified, I started a blog about marriage. Due to a lot of work and a lot of luck, it picked up traction and became my job. Around 2017, a faith crisis tornadoed into my life, leaving a lot of grief and little gratitude in its wake. Strangely, it was the research I was reading on how to make marriages thrive that again and again seemed to provide me the exact wisdom I needed for my faith crisis. I found that the tools necessary to navigate both journeys are the same," end quote. I'll take a second to introduce you to our speaker before she begins. Celeste Davis writes and podcasts about all things marriage. She used to blog for LDS.org back when it was called LDS.org. And now her passion lies in writing about the intersection of marriage and faith. I'll give the floor to you now, Celeste. It's all yours.
Okay. My presentation. Oh. Screen while another participant is sharing the screen. There we go. Okay, cool. All right. Here we go. Okay, so yes, my presentation is called Married to My Faith Crisis. And a little bit about me. I live in Spokane, Washington with my husband and my 4 kids. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in sociology. And I am a marriage educator trained by the Gottman Institute, which is here in Washington. And so I love puzzling out what makes humans connect to each other well, and I love to write. So those two loves go very well together in a marriage blog. So mostly, I didn't start this blog by any means because I am particularly talented at being married. Mostly I do a lot of interviews of experts and marriage therapists, happily married couples. I read a lot of books. And yeah, all of this happened to come in very handy when my faith crisis hit a few years back and sort of took over my life. And I know that the term faith crisis is a rather contested phrase, but believe me when I say this was a crisis for me personally. I was the most black and white thinking Mormon, whoever Mormon. And when my foundation started crumbling, it took with it my identity, my sense of self, my sense of security. It was really devastating. I was really lost and grieving and confused. And I really needed some direction, some guidance. And therapy was definitely a huge help. But again and again, I was finding that the things that I was reading about and researching for my articles on my blog would be so applicable to my relationship with the church. So before I dig into the tools that I believe are really helpful for both of those things, I have to say that my intent with this presentation is not to convince anyone to stay in their marriage or to stay in the church. It turns out that whether or not we stay in our marriages or whether or not we stay in the church, we still must learn how to be our own person, gain self-worth, learning to forgive, learning the skill of boundaries. So with staying or leaving, this sort of inner work is the same journey. The same things are needed. So for this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on four tools really. Building trust and understanding, establishing boundaries, developing self-worth, and then something that I'm going to call the third way. So before we dive into those skills, I want to talk about how the journey of faith and the journey of marriage are so similar to each other. This is a theory from marriage therapist and philosopher Terry Real. He calls it the 3 stages of love. So the first stage of a long-term relationship is called love without knowledge. And this is the honeymoon stage of a relationship. It's a relatively ignorant stage because we're not intimately familiar with each other's faults yet. That's why it's called love without knowledge. But there's a lot of validation and it feels really good and things are just awesome. And then stage 2 hits, and stage 2 is called knowledge without love. And that's where all of our fantasies for what we thought a long-term relationship was going to bring us and what we thought our partner would be, kind of all of those fantasies go to die, and we realize that those are not happening. And we become intimately familiar with the faults and the imperfections of our partner, and those start to inconvenience our own lives. So both stage 1 and stage 2 are pretty transactional. We're asking, what are we getting out of this exchange? And when we move into stage 3, that is where mature love comes in. And it is called love with knowledge, because this is where we fully see the faults of our partner and willingly choose to connect with them and love them anyway. And this is where relationships still have problems, but they can thrive regardless of disagreements and imperfections. So in Father Richard Rohr is a Catholic friar, and he has a book called Falling Upward. And in that book, he lays out 3 stages of a faith journey, which he calls order, disorder, and reorder. He also calls them birth, death, and resurrection. So order is this initial stage of faith where everything's working for us and we're feeling safe and we're feeling comfortable and the rules and the guidelines are all working for us and we're feeling validated. And then disorder is where we start to become familiar with the limitations and the discrepancies and the faults of our faith. It's this deconstruction phase where we examine and question many of the things that we took as truth in the order stage. And then reorder is where we can see both the faults and the merits of both stages. We're able to take what serves us from both the order and the disorder stage and form a new faith, one not based on comfort or validation. So I thought that those sounded really similar, right? In the marriage, the 3 stages, and in a faith, the 3 stages. And so some things I have found this really helpful in both my marriage journey and my faith journey, to know that when stage 2 hits, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with me or my spouse or my faith. It's just a part of the progression. Also with faith, these are really similar to Fowler's faith stages 3, 4, and 5, if you're familiar with those. So some other things that define both the faith journey and the marriage journey, that stage 1 is sort of where our eyes are closed and our hearts are open. We're receiving lots of loving feelings, but our eyes are closed to imperfections that we haven't yet examined. Stage 2, our eyes are wide open, but we tend to wall off our hearts, armor off our hearts in an effort of self-preservation and to shield ourselves from devastation of destroyed expectations. And then in stage 3, we have open eyes and open hearts. That's where we see the faults and we see the good, and we feel all the feelings, happy, mad, overjoyed, frustrated, without needing to shield our hearts from vulnerability, because we've done the work of making our own hearts our home and not something external our home. So we've gained the new eyes to see not just the positive as a stage 1 and not just the negative as stage 2, but both the positive and the negative together. And I also mean that in stage 3, again, you can enter into stage 3 into a mature relationship with both your partner and your church or faith, still without being in that close of proximity to them. Stage 3 can still just be this acceptance stage where you're no longer confined and stuck trying to control something you can't control, which only makes us miserable. But we kind of reach this acceptance of they are what they are, and then we can take the responsibility of deciding for ourselves how close we want to be to them, or what's the position we can be in to be in the most loving relationship to them, whatever that may be. So in terms of expectations, stage 1, in our culture, we live in a culture where the expectations for marriage and relationships in general are just pie in the sky high. Every romantic comedy, every love song, movies and TV shows, they just depict marriage as this goal, as this finish line, and finding a partner should be finding happiness, and our partner should make us happy and fulfill us and all of the things. Liz Gilbert says, marriage becomes hard work once you have poured the entirety of your life's expectations for happiness into the hands of one mere person. Keeping that going is hard work. So stage 1 is where we still have these expectations. And then with our church, for me personally, I put so many expectations on the church. I expected the church to fulfill all my spiritual needs, provide instruction on every aspect of my life. I wanted them to make me feel loved and worthy and included and like I belong. And not to mention all of the expectations I had for the church leaders in my ward and in the church to spiritually fulfill all of its members, create an inclusive social circle for all of the members, meeting everyone's physical, mental, emotional needs. That's a lot. So all these really high expectations, they're sort of inevitably going to fall, and where they fall is in stage 2. So in a marriage or in a long-term relationship, this is where our fantasies with our really high expectations are kind of destroyed. And we realize that our soulmates can't always comfort or validate us. and slowly start to transition to realizing that that's our job, which can be really painful and really a hard transition. So, and then with the church, for me, that looked like realizing, oh, the church isn't able to guide my every decision. I actually need to be responsible for that. And then I will also say it's not possible, Richard Rohr teaches, it's not possible to skip stage 2. I tried really, really hard to skip stage 2, especially in my faith journey. I really wanted to move from having these crazy high, unrealistic expectations and straight into eternal inner peace while sitting in church. But I found that I had to face these collapsed expectations. I had to face really hard truths. And sometimes the things that I learned were making me really angry and critical. Gloria Steinem says, the truth will set you free, but it will piss you off first. And that sounds about right. And the being pissed off part is stage 2. And again, helpful to know in both marriage and faith that it's really normal and not a sign that there's something wrong with us. So stage 3 is all about accepting, taking things for what they are, having realistic expectations. So we abandon our fantasies in order to let something real grow. So for me in my marriage, this was hard because I thought that I was afraid that we would never be as close or have as much love as we did like when we were engaged. I thought that that was our pinnacle. I would never love my husband more than when we were engaged because we just couldn't get enough of each other. We were butterflies everywhere, but it wasn't sustainable and it wasn't realistic because it was based on more fantasy where our eyes were kind of closed. But stage 3 is actually more fulfilling because it's real and because we're allowed to be ourselves and we don't have to be fantasy versions of ourselves. So it's real and it's good. And for the church, managing expectations and engaging with integrity. And again, this is not necessarily meaning that we are staying in the church or staying married again, but that we are coming to a place of inner peace around something that is maybe really hard. So Marianne Williamson says, not forgiving someone is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Forgive others not because they deserve forgiveness, but because we deserve peace. So we determine how far away from our spouse or ex-spouse or church in order to give us the best shot at having an accepting and loving reality with them. And also I want to say that these aren't like set transitions where it's like, oh, I've graduated now to stage 2. Now I've graduated from stage 3. They're kind of more fluid, not like a check mark type of thing, but depending on the day kind of thing. But I think it's helpful to give a roadmap of a goal of where we're going and to know we don't have to stay in stage 2. We can move on to peace and a more peaceful, happy existence in both our marriages and our faith. So hopefully this is a hopeful thing. So now onto the tools that kind of help us go into stage 3. And I also have to say, of course, I would not consider myself to be like happily residing in stage 3 in either my marriage or my faith journey. It's definitely a depending on the day kind of thing. But like I said, I'm going to share some tools that have helped me. So tool number 1, building trust and understanding. So when I say trust and understanding, I'm not saying that for those of us in a faith crisis, we have to just start trusting and understanding the church. This tool is more about maintaining relationships with those who we want to maintain relationships with, which I have found to be really difficult when my faith crisis creates this ever-widening gap or wedge, potentially, my relationship with my family, for instance, some friends. So this section is going to be how to bridge those gaps when they've separated it between us. With people that we really want to keep close relationships with. Okay, so this little model here. There's a story in 2018. Rich and I, we have a podcast called Marriage Karaoke. It's not a word, it's a mix of therapy and karaoke. We give therapy to love songs that give sucky love advice, and we make them better. Anyway, and then re-sing them. So I got a listener request to have an episode about trust. And that's not my forte. I don't know a lot about trust. So we brought on expert, our friend, therapist, Amy Heffernan, and asked her to give us kind of a conceptual model of how to conceptualize trust in a marriage. And what she said was to think of trust as this glass ball hovering between a couple. And when it's intact, neither partner even notices it. It's stable, it's often taken for granted, you can see through it. But when the glass ball shatters, suddenly everything between the couple is different. It affects every interaction, permeates every thought, provides the background noise to every interaction and conversation. And it is possible to repair the glass ball. It just takes a lot of effort and work and cooperation from both partners. It often takes outside help and time, but it is possible. So while we were in our basement interviewing our friend Amy on Zoom, my heart just started pounding, and I was like, oh my gosh, she is describing exactly what has happened between me and the church. I felt like the glass ball that had hovered there my whole life that I didn't even notice suddenly shattered. And suddenly every single interaction I had with the church and its members and the scriptures and the prophets, everything was affected. Suddenly just everything was different without this ball of trust. And I didn't have that strong relationship with the church anymore. And when well-intentioned members would offer me help or solutions in the form of just go to the temple more and pray more and read more, it felt like they were handing me sharp glass shards to suck on. And more than anything else, when I sat amongst the rubble of my broken glass ball, I just longed for the company of other people who were sitting amidst the rubble of their own glass balls. And I realized through this experience the great truth that you trust who you feel understood by. It was really, really hard for me at church to trust people's words who I didn't feel like understood my journey, understood my experiences, who hadn't walked where I had walked or knew what I knew. So if we trust people who we feel understood by, if we have people in our lives that we want to build strong relationships with, then that means the reverse. We have to try to understand them. So here's this quote by John O'Donohue that says, "Love allows understanding to dawn, and understanding is precious. Where you are understood, you are at home. Understanding nourishes belonging. When you really feel understood, you feel free to release yourself into the trust and shelter of the other person's soul." Such a beautiful quote there. So I want to unpack how to utilize this tool of trust and understanding, first in marriage and then in faith. So unfortunately, for a really long time in our marriage, so I don't think I've mentioned yet, but my husband, he had a faith crisis first. His faith started to shake about 8 years ago, probably 4 years before mine ever did. And I will say his didn't cause mine. We were kind of over different issues. But his hit when I was still the most Mormon-y Mormon who ever Mormoned, and I did not handle it well. Understatement. I handled it terribly, like textbook, everything you should not do, I did. I was just like, more scriptures, more prayer, more this, double down on everything, freak out about everything. And I did not even try to understand him because I thought I did understand him. I thought he was just being brainwashed by Twitter. And so I didn't have to. I thought that, I got it and it was fine. But one day I was actually going to fast for him for the millionth time and felt like a really strong prompting. Don't fast for him, fast for you, that you will understand him. And that was shocking to me because I thought he was the problem, not me. I was very righteous and good and holy. And the problem was all on him. And what was really shocking was when I actually started to try to understand him, I realized how I had never really done that before. And I thought I just assumed that I did when I really hadn't taken that effort. So something that really helped me on this and helped us as a couple is the book, The 7 Principles to Make Marriage Work. John Gottman describes an activity that I think is so golden for every marriage. And it's in a chapter he calls gridlock. So when a couple is just fighting over the same issue for years and years and years, and both couples are just stuck in their trenches and not understanding each other, not willing to budge, then he suggests this really great activity. And the activity is that you take this issue you are gridlocked over, that you're not finding a compromise for, like Rich and I were about our faith at the time. And you take one night where you're the speaker and your partner's the listener, and the next night you switch. And when you're the speaker, you get 15 minutes to just let your heart out. And the listener can't say but, they can't come back with rebuttals, they can't make their case. Their only job is to listen, and that's it. And they can't even say anything afterwards except for follow-up questions to make sure they understand. And you switch the next night. So when I read this, I was like, I want to do this because I want to be understood. And I want him to understand me. So I was excited to be the speaker. But what I really understood when I was the listener was how crappy of a listener I actually was. Because what John Gottman says to do when you are the listener is that you have to actually kind of suck all of your preconceived notions about your spouse out of your brain and put them on the shelf for that 15 minutes. Kind of like you have a pensieve from like Harry Potter. You like suck all of what you know about your spouse and you put it away. And you have to act like you are a journalist, that you're objective and that you're just curious and you're trying to figure out why they believe what they do and what their dreams are and what their fears are and what their wishes are. And you're trying to make sure you understand. So you're asking follow-up questions. And when I was doing this and I was leaning in and I was making eye contact, I was realizing, wow, usually when he is making this case, my brain is going on hyperdrive, forming a rebuttal or freaking out and having my anxiety through the roof, or just a million things where there was just no more room in my brain to try to understand him because it was so full of anxiety. And when I did this for the first time and I heard him, I was like, wow, I didn't get that. Like, I got it now. I mean, not fully, but it was a start. And we found it so, so helpful for our marriage. And we've done it since. But just this, when you bring this energy of trying to understand someone without preaching and without making your case, what it does, even if you still disagree, is it enters in this tenderness, even on these gridlocked issues. And the tenderness is what is going to help you build the connection, even in the face of disagreement. And I also unintentionally used this same tool of becoming a journalist in with my faith journey. What kind of started a lot of my questioning was back in, I think, 2014, I had a series on my blog about mixed faith LDS marriages. And so I interviewed couples for that. And I had never really sat down across from someone who had left the church and actually asked them why and tried to understand them. I realize now I definitely should have, because it really just exploded all of my stereotypes. I couldn't think of them the same way that I did ever again. I think everyone should have to do it. But also it helped me maintain a relationship with this couple in our ward who I interviewed, who I had wanted to build a friendship with, but it felt difficult to me because the husband had left. And I sort of wanted to show my support and wanted to be friends, but I felt like it was awkward. Like I was a girl. I didn't want to like get up all in his personal business. I didn't know how comfortable he would be, but they agreed to be interviewed. And me being the journalist and being objective and just being curious about his journey really fostered immediate trust and understanding between us both. And we were able to form a really beautiful friendship with that couple. And it was just very mutually beneficial. Okay, so, all right. So what we really need for the people that we want to build close relationships with is empathy, is putting ourselves in their shoes. And this is hard because we get really caught up. The biggest barrier to empathy is thinking, but they're wrong to think that. This can be definitely on both sides. This happens in marriage all the time. And also in the church, between the divide of people who leave and people who stay, both people are thinking, but they're wrong to think that. And so that's such a big hurdle to cross before we can actually understand what they're going through. But the empathy we need doesn't ask, what are they thinking? And are their thoughts correct? Healing empathy asks, what are they thinking? And if those were my thoughts, what would I be feeling? It's a big difference, and it's really hard. It requires a lot of emotional maturity. So recently I've been wanting to form a closer relationship with my parents, and we kind of butted heads a lot about race recently. And so I was coming into my recent visit to my parents with, I really wanted to change their minds. I wanted to make a strong case that racism is still real. And I was like building up all these evidences. And it was so frustrating to me that we weren't getting anywhere, and I didn't feel like they were understanding me. And then I read the book, How to Have Impossible Conversations. And I realized I was doing everything all wrong in this situation. So I'll just read these 2 quotes here. It says, you can't control someone else's behavior. You can only control your own. So you have to be the one who initially attempts to understand your conversation partner's reasoning, even if they're unwilling to reciprocate. You'll also have to take an active role in establishing and maintaining the partnership dynamic and be ready to walk away if that becomes impossible. And it says, question, how do you switch from viewing people as opponents, moral degenerates, or even enemies to valued partners and collaborators? Answer, shift your goal from winning to understanding. Make understanding your conversation partner's reasoning your initial goal. So basically, I wasn't coming to my parents as a valued partner and collaborator. I was coming as a preacher, and therefore none of our conversations were effective at all. So I can't control whether they want to understand me. The only thing I can do is try to bring this energy of trying to understand them. Even if I think I already do, I don't. They're different humans than me. I don't really understand it. If I bring that energy, that's the best step I can take if I also want to be understood. It's a really hard lesson. I'm still learning it, but I think it applies in a lot of different relationships in and out of the church and in our marriages. Okay, so the next tool is boundaries, establishing boundaries. Boundaries are such a necessary tool to have in our toolkit, both for marriage and for faith journeys. And the opposite of boundaries is codependency. And lest you think this is something that just a few people struggle with here and there, I would say codependency is way more the norm in American relationships than not. Because it's the model, like, again, that we're taught just from our culture at large, from our expectations. We daydream about marriage being the finish line, right? And then someone to complete us, and receiving all of our validation and approval from our partner. So the book Boundaries by Henry Cloud, he has this analogy with houses, saying that both you are a house and your spouse is a house. And in the codependency model, they're unhealthily leaning against each other for stability, not realizing that they'd be much more stable if they were to actually stand on their own 2 feet. But in a codependent relationship, the boundary lines between the two houses, the property lines are not defined. So we don't know where we end and our spouse begins, or where our spouse ends and we begin. So we're taking responsibility for all of our partner's feelings and desires, and we're not taking responsibility for our own desires and our own feelings. It's all enmeshed, and our emotions are enmeshed. So we're positive together, we're negative together, we're riding this roller coaster together, and that can feel like connection and like love, but it's an unhealthy version of it. So boundaries in a healthy relationship, Henry Cloud, he makes the point that the strongest synonym for boundaries is responsibility. Boundaries is taking responsibility for your feelings and your desires, and not taking responsibility for your spouse's feelings and your spouse's desires. That doesn't mean that we're rude to them or that we can't reach out and love, but when we do reach out and we are loving, that's based on our choice, not an obligation or a fear or an inability to handle their negative emotions or handle their desires. So when boundaries are at their best, we're standing solid on our own foundation, our spouse is standing solid in their own, and our boundary lines, our property lines are clearly defined. So we know what we're responsible for and we know what we're not responsible for. And Henry Cloud, in his book, he makes the observation that women particularly are subject to ill-defined boundaries. And he also says in this analogy of the house that your sprinklers need to be watering your own lawn. But what women will a lot of the times do is they'll turn their sprinkler heads around. So they're watering the lawns of their spouse's dreams. They're watering the lawns of managing their spouse's feelings. They're watering the lawns of their children's feelings and their children's dreams and their neighbors and their communities. And meanwhile, their lawn is dying. So he said, what we need to do is take responsibility back for our own desires and our own and our own feelings. And then when our lawn is thriving and we're feeling solid, we're in the very best position we can be to reach out and love, and by choice choose to love and help out our spouse, our children, our neighbors. But you have to first water our own lawns. So with the church, I have found I have tried and failed many times to set healthy boundaries, and it's really hard because it's not the norm. The norm is much more unending self-sacrifice, as is praised and as the goal, and not taking responsibility for what we do. So I would spend so many callings being really bitter and annoyed that so much is on my plate, but feeling so stuck because I wasn't taking responsibility for my desires. And it would have actually been much more loving for me to say, hey, you know what? I have too much on my plate. I don't actually want to be doing this. Can somebody else do this? Or can we drop this program or whatever it was that I was responsible for? That would have been more loving, because as Brene Brown says, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. That goes for our relationships with the church and with our spouse. Okay, so boundaries are really often misunderstood. I thought that for many years I didn't have any boundaries because I long knew that the fastest way to be miserable in your marriage is to try to control what you can't control, to control your partner's behavior. And I thought boundaries, I misunderstood the boundaries to be trying to control our partner. But boundaries do not mean controlling other people's behaviors. Boundaries means you decide how you will respond to other people's behaviors. So examples here, in a marriage, not a boundary, I won't let my partner yell at me. That's not a boundary. A boundary is, if my partner yells at me, I will leave the room. Not a boundary for marriage is, I will not be disrespected. A boundary would be, if I feel disrespected, I will speak up about my feelings. And for church, not a boundary is, my kids won't be taught things I disagree with about chastity and modesty. A boundary would be, if my kids hear something I disagree with, I will talk to them and their leaders. And not a boundary is, I will try not to feel offended by what my bishop says. A boundary would be, if my bishop says something offensive, I will send an email. So boundaries are actually, they often don't feel loving at all because they're very, very hard to set, and they're not usually the norm, and they're not usually praised, and they're often misunderstood. But in fact, boundaries are what allows us to be close to somebody else. Brene Brown says the most loving people are always the most boundaried people, because boundaries are what allows us to love. It's what allows us to hold on to ourselves and reach out in love for somebody else. And it's unfortunately always, always, always easier to just live in resentment than to set a boundary and take responsibility for our own desires and our own feelings. It's really easy to get caught in this trap of, okay, I'll accommodate this, but I'm going to be resentful for it, both in marriage and with the church. But it's more loving to set clear and firm boundaries. All right, tool number 3, developing self-worth. So this, in my opinion, self-worth is the most important tool. It is at the heart of all of healthy relationships and healthy self-development. So this is my favorite marriage quote here. It's by Dr. David Schnarch. It says, the most loving thing we can do for our spouse is to learn to regulate our own anxiety. What does that have to do with self-worth? Well, if we don't have self-worth, it's too threatening and difficult to regulate our own anxiety, to face our own anxiety. So we need other people to do it for us. So we're codependent on someone else to provide us with acceptance and validation and approval that we should be able to manage for ourselves. So the most loving thing we can do is to develop that self-worth, so then we are able to regulate our own anxiety and handle our self-confrontation that needs to be happening for any relationship to thrive. So I think this is the heart of it all, because we just can't form healthy relationships with either our spouse or our faith when shame is at the wheel. When shame is running the show, nothing will thrive. So when shame's at the wheel of our relationships, again, we'll just be seeking external validation from our spouse. And again, not having those boundaries of what we're responsible for. And with our faith, similarly, it's all going to start with a solid sense of self-worth. So here's a little diagram that I came up with to try to explain my theory of marriage in general. I often use this example of the onion. So the external of the onion are the external behaviors: communicating, fighting, sex, money, parenting. And typically what happens when we have problems in a marriage, we only want to deal with the outside of the onion. We don't want to peel back the layers, because that can be scary and intimidating and feel threatening. So we just really want to manage, just like, oh, it's just money. It's just that's our only thing. I don't need to self-confront. Nothing's going on. If we just agreed about that, our relationship would be fine. But there's always things going on under the surface, and our inability to peel back the layers of the onion is what keeps us stuck. So the next layer of the onion, once you peel back external behaviors, is going to be our mental constructs, our thoughts, our expectations, and our ability to question our own thoughts and question our own expectations and see what we're thinking, see what our narrative is, what stories we're telling ourselves, whether those are serving us or not, and just question our own reality. That alone is going to make our marriages way better, our ability to do that, instead of just assuming all of our thoughts are immediately reality. And then the core of it all is our sense of self and our self-worth and our integrity. So another way I use this model is as a pyramid. And the base, the foundation of a pyramid of marital stability has to be our sense of self and our self-worth. Because if we're just dealing with the externals, it's like it's just building your foundation on sand. It's just going to crumble. It's not going to be solid. We have to have that foundation under us of self-worth. A wise man builds his house upon a rock, right? Not sand. And the rock is our self-worth. And then we'll be able to have the tools to manage our external conflicts and things that bother us, because we'll have that core of knowing we're going to be okay no matter what. and have this innate worth no matter what. So it's okay if we disagree. It's okay if we have problems. But our most important tool is going to be our own self-worth in marriage. Similarly, in spirituality. So I spent a lot of my years in the church really, really focused on externals: obedience, church attendance, tithing, temple, all of the checkmark stuff, all of the list stuff. And then wondering why I would feel so unsatisfied, even if I was doing everything, or I was in this frantic rat race to complete every check mark, and still feeling like I'm not progressing or unfulfilled. So I had to peel back those layers and get at the core of the problem. And the core of the problem for me personally was that the God that I used to believe in was always disappointed in me. And it gave me a really crappy sense of self-worth. And I had to move past that and develop that and know that even when I'm sinning, even when I'm making mistakes, I'm still innately worthy, that my worth is not dependent on my behaviors, and that God is not always disappointed in me. I had to build that loving God that gives me this sense of worth and love and wholeness. And then from my wholeness, I can then manage how I want my external behaviors spiritually to look. Okay, last tool here. The goal is the third way. This mostly is coming because I'm reading right now The Radical King, about the life of Martin Luther King and a lot of his sermons. But basically, this trap that we're running into again and again and again in our marriages and in our faith journeys is black and white thinking. It's either or thinking, and it's passivity or it's aggression. So in marriage, I was caught in this trap constantly with marital conflict. And I knew that I didn't want to be aggressive. I didn't want to fight. So I thought to keep the peace, I had to just be passive all the time. I had to just be submissive. And when something bothered me, I just say, I just need more service. I just need more selflessness. I just need to not get mad. I just need to shut it all down. La, 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 la. I'm fine. Right? And that did not lead to a strong marriage. But also, sometimes when things would really bug me, I thought that in order to get my point across, in order to know, for my husband to know that I wasn't passive about something, I had to be extra aggressive. I had to be extra critical or blaming or defensive. And that didn't work either. That didn't build a strong connection either. So there had to be this third way, this middle way between when I had a conflict, not to be passive and not to be aggressive. And I've also run into this in the church all the time too, thinking my black and white thinking, thinking I had to either be all in and just plug my ears to the things that would bug me at church and just la, 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 I'm fine. I just need more selflessness. I just need more faith. Not even focusing on the things that bothered me at all. Or I had to just be this head on fire, raging, crazy mad person at everything and all things church, right? But there is a third way that Martin Luther King talks about so beautifully. So in the book, The Radical King, they say that Martin Luther King was so radical in his love and in his just love of everybody and his commitment to nonviolence. And he was also very radical that he would not support evil institutions and evil laws. So those things often don't go together. And he was his whole career so pressured to be more passive and just say, not, do the protests and just say, it's okay, we'll get there eventually. It's fine. We're progressing. Just don't cause any trouble. Don't do that. Just be more accepting and more passive, right? Or he was pressured to be more aggressive. No, we're not going to solve this without violence. And he was so committed to the third way of non-violence, where he was both very firm in his beliefs and very firm in his love. So this third way is going to be our ticket to a really healthy marriage and a really healthy relationship with our faith. So in a marriage, for me, this looks like not being a doormat, right? And when something bothers me, knowing that I don't have to fight when something bothers me, I can stand in my own integrity and I can stand firm and I can say, you know what, I deserve to pursue these dreams. My dreams matter. My personhood matters. My desires matter. And I can stand firm in that with love. So my only two options when I am bugged is not to just lay down, and it's not to fight. It's a third way. And then also in the church, some ways this plays out for me often with the black and white thinking is that I get tempted to think that like Joseph Smith was either, you know, the most holy man next to God, like just like deity, or he was this insane, molesting, crazy, you know, awful, terrible demon. And the truth is somewhere in the middle, like most things, right? So with my relationship with the church, I have to always check myself if I'm being black and white and trying to follow my conscience and find that middle, the third way. So knowing that my conscience is worthy, is good, even when it disagrees with the church, and knowing I can love both the people in my life who are in and the people who are out, and whatever way they are in between, and knowing that I have my own autonomy, that I have my own sovereignty, that I can make my own decisions, and I can be in my integrity in those even when people disagree with my decisions. So,
Hey, we are at about an 8-minute mark here, just as a reminder.
Okay, well, that's good because now that I'm done, that's my last slide here. So those are my tools, and yeah, that's my presentation.
All right, well, that's awesome. Thank you so very much. And if any of you want to ask a question, go ahead and post it in the Whova app. I have a few here that I'm going to go ahead and read for Celeste to answer. First one, is the goal always to stay in a marriage? Many Mormons get married so young and change and grow out of the reasons that they initially entered into the partnership with. There's still a huge stigma around divorce. What advice would you give to people who end up divorcing through this process?
I definitely do not think the goal should always be to stay together. I think there can be, like I was explaining with boundaries, I think that sometimes the most loving thing we can do to have ourselves love someone else is to stand far away from them so that we can still maintain our sense of self, maintain our integrity. And yeah, it's a journey we have to dig really down deep into that self-worth when we are actively disappointing or having people disapprove of our choices. You have to be so firm in your own ability to self-validate when you're not getting that validation from everyone around you. It's so hard. I haven't walked that journey personally, but I have all the empathy in the world because it takes so much inner strength to be able to handle that lack of approval and that lack of validation.
Thank you. Let's see, the next one, and I'm not sure how this is in context this is. I tried to reach out to this person and get a little bit of clarity, but I didn't know if it was being asked about the believing side or the non-believing side. But the question is, do you think there is a difference in how to handle a faith crisis when it is initiated by the man versus the woman? I think that a woman can get a double whammy because of the benevolent patriarchy of the church. They may have princess syndrome, which gets shattered when they see their husband as another flawed human trying to figure things out.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely can be different, absolutely, and can be really, really hard. We definitely have gender stereotypes alive and thriving in this church that makes a faith crisis manifest and thought of in different ways, and that can be really, really, really hard. I think that the tools that I talked about in this presentation of self-worth and self-validating and boundaries and are all going to apply, but it can definitely be different. Absolutely. I would say your experience is real and valid. And yeah, hopefully that those same tools will apply, but the nuances of the situation could definitely be different for a man and a woman.
Great, thank you. Here's another question. Is one always justified in enforcing boundaries when one realizes it might be hurting the feelings of someone else, or that the other person feels that their feelings are being ignored or disregarded?
This one's really, really tough because especially in relationships where boundaries are not the norm, where codependency has been much more the norm, even just stating your boundary, even if you try really hard to do it from integrity without any aggression, it can often be taken as aggressive. It can be taken as you're not validating them. But on the other side, a lot of times we can be really self-righteous and like set lots of lines in the sand, and it can be understandable for our partner to be like, hey, what about me? So I would say this one's so hard, and I think that really the only thing you have to do is really dig down deep into your integrity, and in that self-soothing, make sure that you are coming to your spouse when you have to set a boundary with as much love as you can have in your heart and as little ego, which I know is much easier said than done. But just to be able to say it in a way that they can hear it. Because if we say it in a way that's like, you're always doing this and you need to do this, their defenses are going to shoot up. The conversation is not going to be productive. But if we can say it in a way that we can validate ourselves and know that our desires matter, and that saying, hey, I'm feeling this is really hurting my feelings. Next time you do this, I'm going to do this. Then that's going to be controlling the part that we can control. We can't control our partner's reaction to it. We can only control how we present it and trying our very, very best to be in our own integrity and to come as our best selves.
Great, thank you. That's all the questions that came in. So I guess our time is over, and if anybody has a last minute question, we do have time for one more if anybody wants to get that in real quick. And while we're sitting for a minute, I just really like to thank you, Celeste, for your presentation today. And I would like to thank everyone else for coming today and for being here. Really appreciate your support, and we'll go ahead and end, and have a great evening.
Thanks.